The Last of Us is seen as a special franchise in the gaming landscape, with unimaginable amounts of praise shouldered onto the original game, which has become a hugely influential title in the generations that followed. But since then, that iconic tale of The Last of Us has been retold so many times in the form of 2 remakes and a live-action series, leading people to think that the game is being milked for all it's worth. And now, with The Last of Us Part 2 being remastered only 4 years after release, with almost no discernible visual differences, the boiling point has reached an all-time high, and the once legendary franchise is being seen as a corporatized shell of its former self. So let's take a look at why The Last of Us is being scrutinized in this way, when other franchises can be milked as much as possible and no one bats an eye. The primary reason The Last of Us is seen as different to all those other franchises is how seriously the game takes itself. It tells a deathly mature story, and while gaming had seen plenty of mature stories by this point, there was always an air of irony or whimsy hanging in the background, like with Metal Gear Solid or Grand Theft Auto 4. The Last of Us was one of the first games to tell a serious story with a completely straight face, emulating as much as it could from Oscar-nominated films, which today could be interpreted as an insult to storytelling in gaming, but at the time was heavily praised for equalizing the playing field between the two mediums. Because of this steadfast maturity, The Last of Us is considered a sacred and important piece of art like those Oscar-nominated films it's emulating, and remaking it is like remaking or making a sequel to films like Sophie's Choice or Apocalypse Now. But that's forgetting the critical differences between movies and games. If you want to watch Apocalypse Now, then that film will always be available on some kind of streaming service. But video games live and die by their publishers and the consoles they release on. It's one of the biggest problems not being talked about in gaming today, how preservation is seen as a bad thing by publishers because it means they can't repackage and resell their old titles for a premium price every few years. So when the PS4 was released 6 months after The Last of Us, it was essential for Sony to re-release the game in order to preserve it for the influx of new players brought in by the console, as it wouldn't make sense for it to rot on the PS3. So The Last of Us Remastered doesn't feel like a cash grab to me. It's more like an essential preservation of an extremely modern classic. Then we get to the controversial Last of Us Part 1 remake, seen by many as a waste of Naughty Dog's time, and an ultimately pointless remake for a game that was already available on the system. But I'd argue that this remake, while not necessary, was a good idea on Sony's part, and the reason for this is tied into the live-action adaptation that was released a few months later. When I was homeschooled by a tutor who liked games, we made a deal. I would play Skyrim if he would play The Last of Us, which was a fair deal because he was much busier than I was. Over the 2 years we spent together, he only made it to the skyscraper level early on in the game, because he had found the game frustrating even on the easiest difficulty, and when the game introduced the instant kill clicker enemies, he realised he couldn't progress any further. When it comes to shooters, he was essentially a casual, and with the live-action show coming up, there was going to be an influx of casuals pouring into The Last of Us. So by remaking the game to show off the shiny new graphics of the PS5, while adding accessibility features galore, The Last of Us Part 1 Remake was an essential game to make. And I understand if you think that I'm reaching here, but if you ever get the chance to look at a publisher's graph between casual and core fans, and you see just how few core fans there are in comparison, then you'll understand why companies choose to do scummy things, because there are always masses of casuals who will still buy their games no matter how angry the core fans get. So now we arrive at the modern day, with The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered, and this is the first game where I'll say it wasn't necessary to remaster, and they are just trying to get the new influx of players to pay $70 when Season 2 of the show launches. But that's why they're going above and beyond with this remaster, adding a roguelike mode and adding lost content. This is far greater than a simple remaster, and it's an absolute steal for a $10 upgrade. Though this remaster may seem out of the blue, I bet that if the Hollywood strikes didn't happen, we'd already have the first trailer for the second season, and it would be looming on the horizon. I don't think remakes are hurting The Last of Us, and I think Sony has just as much reverence for the franchise as you and I do. I believe that one of the reasons the online game was cancelled was because they couldn't find a way to make it without terrible live service elements that would muddy the franchise's name, and hey, there's a reason that Kratos is in Fortnite but Joel and Ellie aren't. The Last of Us is an incredibly special franchise to everyone. That's why people get so angry when the franchise goes in a direction they don't agree with. And while Part 2 Remastered isn't an essential upgrade for the game, the additions that they're adding prove to me that Naughty Dog and Sony have massive respect for their most prestigious franchise.